Before the skyscrapers, before the red buses, before Big Ben, the Beatles, the bombers, the plague, the fire, the empire, the Normans, before any of it, there was a river. Just a river. Wide, cold, tidal, churning gray-brown through a swampy, forested landscape that no modern Londoner would recognize. No city, no roads, no name. And then, in 43 AD, 40,000 Roman soldiers arrived on the southern coast of Britain, and everything changed. In 2,000 years, this city will be invaded, burned to the ground, struck by plague not once but 4 times, nearly obliterated by the Nazis, and still end up as one of the most powerful cities on earth. Here's how that actually happened.
The Roman Emperor Claudius, yes, the one who walks with a limp and stutters in every historical drama, ordered the invasion of Britain for reasons that were, honestly, mostly political. He needed a military victory to look strong back in Rome. Britain was the edge of the known world. Conquering it would be spectacular. The Romans crossed the Thames at a spot where it was narrow enough to ford, roughly where London Bridge stands today, and they built a camp on the north bank. They called it Londinium. Nobody's entirely sure what the name meant. It may have come from a pre-Roman Celtic word. It may have meant something like the wild place or the bold place. We genuinely don't know. But Londinium's location was genius. The river was deep enough for large ships right up to that point, then became too shallow for ocean-going vessels further inland. It was the perfect trading post, the furthest point ships could reach from the sea, and the nearest point to the sea that you could bridge. Within 2 decades, it had a forum, a basilica, a governor's palace, public baths, and a bridge. By 60 AD, it was already the most important city in Roman Britain. And then a queen burned it to the ground. Every building, every person, gone. Her name was Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, and she had very good reasons to be furious. When her husband, the local king, died, the Romans promised to honor his will, which left half his kingdom to Rome and half to his daughters. Instead, the Romans seized everything. They flogged Boudica publicly. They attacked her daughters. What followed was one of history's most ferocious uprisings. Boudica united several tribes under her command and marched on Camulodunum, modern Colchester, and razed it. Then she turned south, Londinium. The Roman governor had already pulled his troops away to fight elsewhere. The city was essentially undefended. Residents were warned to flee. Most didn't or couldn't. Boudica's forces, estimated at 100,000 warriors, swept through Londinium and destroyed it completely. Archaeological digs today, right now, under the city of London, still find a thick red layer of burned soil from around 60 AD. They call it the Boudican Destruction Horizon, an entire city turned to ash, preserved in a stripe of red clay 2,000 years underground. Boudica was eventually defeated by the Romans in a battle somewhere in the Midlands. She died, possibly by poison, possibly by illness. The Romans rebuilt Londinium, bigger this time. Londinium would grow into a city of 30,000 people, and then, without warning, the Romans would simply leave, and London would almost cease to exist entirely.
At its height, Roman Londinium was extraordinary. Population around 30,000, roughly comparable to many modern towns. A forum the size of a football pitch. The largest basilica north of the Alps. Stone walls 3 meters thick surrounding the city, sections of which are still standing today, embedded in the basements of office buildings in the City of London. The Romans built roads radiating outward from London to every corner of Britain. All roads famously led to Rome, but in Britain they all led to Londinium first. Then, in 410 AD, Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Roman Britain. It essentially said, "You're on your own, defend yourselves." The empire was collapsing under pressure from Gothic invaders in the south. Troops were pulled from Britain to defend Rome. The administrators left, the merchants left, the money left. And Londinium, this prosperous city of 30,000 people, went almost silent. Within a few generations, it was largely abandoned. The population collapsed, the forums fell into ruin, the roads still existed, but nobody was building along them anymore. Archaeologists call the next few centuries the Dark Earth, because when you dig down, there's simply a layer of black soil. Nothing was being recorded, nothing was being built to last. The city forgot itself. London lay dormant for 200 years. Then the Saxons arrived and rebuilt everything from scratch, slightly to the west. The result would eventually become the most powerful city in the medieval world. But first, the Vikings.
Here's something nobody teaches you in school. The Saxons didn't move into the old Roman city. They built a new one, about a mile to the west. They called it Lundenwic, wic meaning trading settlement. It grew up around what is now the Strand and Covent Garden. For centuries, when Londoners talked about London, they meant a place that no longer looks like London at all. By the 7th century, it had grown into one of the most important trading ports in Northern Europe. Thousands of people, an international market. Ships from Scandinavia, France, the Rhineland. The Venerable Bede, writing in the early 700s, called it a mart of many peoples coming by land and sea. Then, in 842 AD, the Vikings arrived, and they kept coming back.
The Viking raids on London were not occasional incidents. They were sustained, repeated, and increasingly organized campaigns. 842 AD, a great slaughter in London. 851 AD, 350 Viking ships in the Thames. 871 AD, a full Danish army camps outside the city for a whole winter. In 886 AD, King Alfred the Great, who had been fighting the Danes across England for years, made a decisive move. He abandoned the Saxon Lundenwic and Plierley and reoccupied the old Roman city walls. The Romans had been gone for 400 years, but their walls still worked. Alfred's London, now called Lundenburg, was strategically brilliant. The wall made it nearly impregnable. He laid out streets, established markets, organized the city. The street plan he created in the 880s still survives in the layout of the city of London today. But the Vikings didn't give up easily. In 1013, Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard actually conquered all of England, including London. For a brief, strange moment, London was ruled by a Viking king. Then Sweyn died suddenly, his son Canute took over, and, in a twist, actually became a decent king of England for nearly 20 years. The great Viking era of London ends with one of history's more dramatic moments. In 1014, the Saxons and their Norwegian allies rowed up the Thames, attached ropes to London Bridge, and pulled it down, with Danes still standing on it. This is possibly the origin of the nursery rhyme, "London Bridge is falling down." We're not 100% certain, but it fits. London survived the Vikings. It would not survive what came next quite so intact. In 1066, everything, the language, the culture, the ruling class, the architecture, changed overnight. October 14th, 1066, the Battle of Hastings. William of Normandy defeats King Harold. Harold takes an arrow, allegedly to the eye, and dies. You know this part. What's less discussed is what happened to London specifically. William didn't march straight into London and take it. The Londoners resisted. They backed a different king. William burned and raided the surrounding countryside, cutting off the city's food supply until London had no choice but to submit. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, a church that Edward the Confessor had just finished building and which he died too soon to be crowned in himself. What William did next to London was both shrewd and brutal. he immediately granted the city a charter, essentially promising to respect London's existing rights and laws. Londoners could keep their customs, their merchants could keep trading. This was clever politics. And then he built the Tower of London. The tower, the White Tower at its core, was not primarily a prison, it was a statement. Standing just inside the eastern corner of the old Roman walls, it was the largest building in England. It could be seen from everywhere in the city. It said, in stone, "I am here. I am permanent. Do not try anything." The Normans also completely transformed the English language. Before 1066, English was Old English, essentially a Germanic language. After the conquest, the ruling class spoke French. For 300 years, English was the language of peasants and Normans was the language of power. The English we speak today is the result of those two languages slowly, messily merging. London was where that merger happened most intensely. Medieval London was about to become Europe's most chaotic, vibrant, violent, and pestilential city. Over the next 300 years, it would be visited by the Black Death, which would kill nearly half of everyone living there.
Paint the smell, the noise, make it visceral. Medieval London is not romantic. Medieval London was, by modern standards, genuinely horrifying to be in. The population had grown to perhaps 80,000 by the early 1300s. The streets were narrow, muddy, and ankle-deep in animal waste. Pigs wandered freely. Open sewers ran down the middle of alleys. The Thames, which people also drank from, was essentially an open sewer for the entire city. And yet it was extraordinary. The city was a riot of noise and commerce. Fish markets, cloth markets, bread markets, all operating simultaneously. St. Paul's Cathedral loomed over everything. The medieval St. Paul's, which was actually taller than the current one, and whose spire, before lightning destroyed it in 1561, was one of the tallest structures in Europe. London Bridge, the stone one, built between 1176 and 1209, was one of the wonders of medieval Europe. It wasn't just a bridge, it was a street. Shops and houses lined both sides. It had a drawbridge, a chapel, and a gatehouse. On the gatehouse, starting in 1305, the heads of executed traitors were displayed on spikes. At times, there were over 30 heads up there simultaneously, preserved in tar. This was considered normal. And then, in 1348, a ship docked in southern England, carrying something in its cargo that would kill nearly half the people in this city within 18 months. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348. It reached London by winter of that year. The plague, almost certainly bubonic plague, spread by fleas on rats, moved through the city with terrifying speed. Symptoms: swollen lymph nodes in the armpits and groin, fever, and blackened skin as tissue died. Most victims were dead within days of showing symptoms. Before the plague, London had roughly 80,000 people. Estimates suggest that between 1348 and 1350, somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 Londoners died in under 2 years. That's potentially more than half the population. The city ran out of places to bury the dead. Emergency mass graves were dug outside the city walls. In 2013, construction workers in London found one of them. Hundreds of plague skeletons arranged in neat rows in what is now the Barbican area. They were still there 660 years later. The Black Death didn't visit just once. It returned to London in 1361, 1368,
1375, and then repeatedly through the 15th century. London would not return to its pre-plague population for over 200 years. But here's what the plague did that nobody expected. It gave the survivors enormous power. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers. Peasants could demand higher wages. The rigid social order began, slowly, to crack. The medieval world was dying, and out of the wreckage would come something new. A Renaissance, a Reformation, and a Tudor dynasty that would transform London into the center of a new kind of power.
By 1500, London's population had recovered to about 50,000. A century later, it was 200,000. The city was exploding. The Tudors, Henry VIII, Henry IX, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, used London as a stage for power. Henry VIII alone transformed the city's geography. He dissolved the monasteries, seized their vast landholdings in and around London, and redistributed them to the nobility. Overnight, whole sections of the city changed hands. Priories became palaces, gardens became streets. It was also under Henry VIII that the Church of England was born, not for theological reasons, but because the Pope wouldn't grant Henry a divorce. This seems petty, but its consequences for London were vast. Churches, ceremonies, saints' days, the entire spiritual calendar of the city, all ripped up and replaced. Elizabeth I turned London into the cultural capital of the world. Under her reign, a playwright named William Shakespeare was writing his plays for audiences of all classes at the Globe Theatre on the South Bank. The same week that lords and merchants watched Hamlet, apprentices and fishwives saw it too. London was a city where, uniquely for the time, culture was public. This golden age was about to be interrupted by one of the strangest and most brutal episodes in London's history: a king beheaded in the street outside his own palace. But before that, one final catastrophic act of nature.
1665. The plague returned. This time it was different. Not the bubonic plague of the medieval era, but a virulent new outbreak that tore through London's overcrowded, unsanitary streets with catastrophic speed. Official death toll, 68,596, almost certainly an undercount. Roughly 15% of the entire city's population dead in a single year. The wealthy fled to the countryside. The poor stayed and died. Victims were shut into their houses, a red cross painted on the door, the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." The city was a ghost town. And then, 1 year later, a different kind of disaster. September 2, 1666, 2 a.m., a bakery on Pudding Lane caught fire. London at this time was almost entirely made of wood. The summer had been brutally dry. A strong easterly wind was blowing. The fire spread instantly, jumping from building to building, racing through streets that were only a few meters wide. It burned for 4 days. When it was over, 13,200 houses had been destroyed, 87 churches gone, St. Paul's Cathedral reduced to rubble. An estimated 70,000 people out of a city of 80,000 in the walled area were left homeless. Remarkably, the official death toll was only 6. We don't really believe that number, but the city burned too fast for many to be trapped. The fire did something unexpected. It cleared out the plague. The slums, the warrens, the rat-infested wooden warrens, gone. London had to be rebuilt, and rebuilt it did. A man named Christopher Wren was given the task of redesigning the entire city. He wanted to build something like Paris. London had other ideas.
architectural awe. Brief but beautiful, then pivot fast to the empire. Christopher Wren presented a bold plan, a new London on a grid with wide boulevards radiating from key points like Paris or Rome. It was extraordinary on paper. London rejected it almost immediately. The reason was property. Every landowner knew exactly where their land was, and they weren't about to give it up for some architect's vision. Within weeks of the fire, people were rebuilding on their old foundations, in their old street patterns. What Wren got instead was the churches, 52 of them, each different, each a masterpiece, and St. Paul's Cathedral. The new St. Paul's took 35 years to build and remains one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. Wren is buried in its crypt. His epitaph reads, Lector si monumentum requiris circumspice. Reader, if you seek his monument, look around you. The rebuilt London was about to become something the world had never seen before, the capital of a global empire spanning 24% of the Earth's surface. And it would do it on the backs of slaves, soldiers, and the single most important financial innovation in history.
This is the big scope section. Think global. Let the numbers overwhelm. By 1800, London was the largest city on Earth. Population, 1 million. By 1900, 6.5 million. Nothing like this had ever existed. The British Empire, administered from London, stretched across Canada, India, Australia, large parts of Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond. 1 in 4 people on the planet lived under British rule. All the wealth of that empire, cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, wool from Australia, diamonds from South Africa, flowed through London. But this wealth came at a cost that London largely chose not to see. The slave trade, centered on Bristol and Liverpool, but financed through London's banks, transported over 3 million enslaved Africans to the Americas. When slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, the government paid out £20 million in compensation to the slave owners, not to the enslaved. London's financial system grew up alongside the empire. The Bank of England, founded in 1694. Lloyd's of London, insuring ships carrying human cargo. The London Stock Exchange. The foundations of modern global capitalism were laid in Georgian London's coffee houses and counting houses. The Industrial Revolution reached London later than the north of England, but its effects were acute. The city sprawled outward as railways made commuting possible. Gaslighting made the streets walkable at night, and the Thames increasingly became something catastrophic. In 1858, the River Thames smelled so terrible that Parliament had to close its windows, and nobody could sit near the river. They called it the Great Stink, and it would lead to one of the greatest engineering projects in history.
1858, the Thames was essentially a 200-mile open sewer. The smell in summer was so overpowering that members of Parliament soaked the curtains of the Houses of Parliament in chloride of lime to avoid fainting at their desks. The Great Stink, they called it. 30 years of cholera outbreaks, tens of thousands dead, had already pointed at the river as the source, but nobody had done anything. A civil engineer named Joseph Basil Jett proposed a solution, a completely new underground sewer system for the entire city. 1,300 miles of new sewers, massive intercepting tunnels running alongside the Thames, pumping stations. It took years and cost a fortune. It saved London. And the land reclaimed from the river to build the new sewer tunnels, that became the Victoria Embankment, the road and park that still runs along the Thames today. Fast forward, September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe begins the Blitz, 57 consecutive nights of bombing London.
The East End, the Docks, Coventry, Bermondsey, some of the poorest parts of the city, took the worst of it. 43,000 civilians killed, 1 million homes damaged or destroyed. London did not break. Defiant, bloody, exhausted, but it did not break. Photographs of St. Paul's Cathedral rising above the smoke, unscathed despite the bombs falling around it, became the most iconic images of the war. And in 1948, 3 years after the war ended, the newly elected Labour government did something radical. It created the National Health Service, free healthcare for every person in Britain, funded by taxation. It was born in London's hospitals. To this day, it is what many Londoners consider the greatest thing Britain ever created. London survived the Blitz, rebuilt from rubble, and invited the world in. Over the next 80 years, it would become the most international city that has ever existed and face an entirely new set of questions about what it even means to be London.
After the war, London changed again, radically, and not always easily. The Windrush generation arrived from the Caribbean in 1948, invited to help rebuild a devastated country. They were followed by waves of immigrants from South Asia, East Africa, Hong Kong, Nigeria, Poland, Bangladesh, and dozens of other places. Today, over 300 languages are spoken in London. More than 37% of its residents were born outside the UK. It is, by any measure, the most diverse city on Earth. The 1960s made London a global cultural capital. The Beatles, the Stones, Bowie, the King's Road, Carnaby Street, Twiggy. The 1980s reshaped its economy. Thatcher deregulated the financial markets. The City of London became a global banking hub, and Canary Wharf rose from derelict docklands. The city was bombed again by the IRA through the 1990s and by suicide bombers on July 7, 2005, killing 52 people on buses and underground trains. It hosted the Olympics in 2012. It voted to remain in the EU in 2016, then watched the rest of England vote to leave, a fracture that has not fully healed. Today, London is a city of 9 million people, speaking 300 languages, generating a larger autonomy than Sweden, full of contradictions, tensions, and extraordinary energy. The Roman walls are still there, underground. Boudica's ash is still there. Plague victims are still there. The city has been invaded, burned, bombed, and reinvented a dozen times over. It has forgotten itself and remembered itself. It has made things that changed the world: the English language, parliamentary democracy, the global financial system, and done terrible things in the name of an empire it is still reckoning with. It is 2,000 years old and still arguing about what it wants to be. That, probably, is the most London thing about it.
If you made it to the end, thank you. 2,000 years and 30 minutes is, look, it's not nothing. We've barely scratched the surface. There are entire centuries we skipped. The Peasants' Revolt, the Gunpowder Plot, Jack the Ripper, the Suffragettes, the Festival of Britain, the rise of the NHS, punk, Brixton, Notting Hill Carnival. Each of those is a different video. Subscribe if you want those videos. Leave a comment with the London story you think we should tell next. And if this was useful to you, share it. History belongs to everyone.